So thank you, Charles, for joining us again. This seminar is really the lead up to a panel that I'm on at the Bank of Canada. So the Bank of Canada is actually in the process of developing something that we would describe as a prudent risk management approach and so on. But before we go there, we want to explain to our audience what the prudent risk management approach is all about, and so on, and what it would take a central bank uh, to get ready to develop and implement it, and so on. So, first thing is Governor Waller, when I was at a recent conference at the Bank of Korea, described Armenia, or the central bank of Armenia, as being the new New Zealand, and so on. And this is in reference to the fact that everybody knows, especially Charles and myself, and people old enough to remember 1990, when the Reserve Bank of New Zealand announced that they were doing inflation targeting. Actually, they announced it a year earlier, but they started it in 1990, and they worked without a framework like the FPAS for several years. In fact, it wasn't until I left the Bank of Canada in 1993 and went to the research department of the IMF that I started to get a lot of requests to basically provide advice to central banks. So I went to New Zealand and fleshed out what a forecasting and policy analysis system was. And then a few colleagues from the Bank of Canada, David Rose, Richard Black, went to New Zealand and helped them develop forecasting and policy analysis system. And then Benjamin Hunt, who had implemented it at the Bank of Canada, also went there to help them implement it. And so by 1998, they had this thing called the forecasting and policy analysis system. And if we were going to describe it very simply, it involved these three essential ingredients. First, where is the economy today? So estimating things like the neutral rate and the natural rate of unemployment and the output gap and so on. And what are the underlying forces driving the economy? And that's, of course, a little bit connected to that first question. But truly the distinguishing characteristic is that you then ask, what do I need to do with my instruments to achieve my objectives? Now, we used to call that inflation forecast targeting. We used to use another word, flexible inflation targeting, synonymously with inflation forecast targeting. But the idea was that the central bank uses its inflation forecast as an ideal intermediate target. So it figures out a path for the policy rate that is consistent with bringing inflation gradually back to the target in a way that it efficiently manages any short run trade-offs, like, for example, the short run inflation output trade-off, or in the case of the United States, you could think of it as the inflation unemployment trade-off, and so on. To develop an FPAS Mark I regime, it took New Zealand about 3 years. We then did it in many, many emerging market countries, such as the Czech National Bank and many, many central banks around the world, and so on. So Asia Kastanian, that's with us here, recently wrote a paper on monetary policy transparency, and it finally agrees completely with Ben Bernanke's analysis and his presentation at the Thomas Loback conference this year. That was the run up to discussing revisions to the new framework in the United States. Okay, so this includes the statement of long run objectives as well as communication. So they promised that they will be uh, announcing the revisions to the statement of long run objectives and strategy fairly soon. It wouldn't surprise me if something comes out in Jackson Hole tomorrow and so on. But then the second part in the fall, turning to the important issues of communication and so on. FPAS Mark II is effectively eliminating um, the baseline as we thought about it when we thought about inflation forecast targeting. And the idea is for a place like the Central Bank of Armenia, where you have an a board where each board member is individually accountable, implementing inflation forecast targeting was very difficult because obviously, if you wanted to influence the policy, you had to get each board member had to try and get their idea into that baseline, and so obviously that wasn't the best way to, I think, use the central bank's resources or the policymakers that that were thinking about the world differently. And so the idea behind FPAS Mark II is to implement what we describe as least regrets policies, and to think about what it is that policymakers are concerned about, and then after you go through that process, to then communicate it to the public and to financial markets and so on. The journey of FPAS Mark II really started in October of 2022 when we wrote our first paper. There's a paper with David Archer and Governor Gelstian and myself called The Folly of Baselines. And Governor Gelstian presented that at the IMF annual meetings and stuff. He's going to be here later in about a half an hour, and will offer his reflections on that. But from October 2022, we then had to train the staff at the Central Bank of Armenia, and then by January of last year, we then produced a book and launched what we call FPAS Mark II, or the Prudent Risk Management Approach. So we've had about 18 months to implement it. You can go onto the central bank's website and see what a monetary policy report looks like under FPAS Mark II. And more recently, they have developed a transparency report, which includes the minutes plus a statement by each one of the board members that describes the rationale for why they made or voted for the decision that they voted for, as well as description of the types of scenarios that they were concerned about, providing a rationale for their policy decisions, and providing information about how they think about monetary policy, so that if the world starts to play out in a particular way, that financial markets are prepared and start adjusting interest rates in anticipation that the central bank is going to do the right thing and so on. We recently wrote a paper for the Oxford Review of Economic Policy It started off as a paper on the state of macro, but then the editor asked us to talk about some of the issues that were raised by Ben Bernanke in his review of the Bank of England framework. So if you want to understand the model or the analytical framework that we use, which involves endogenous monetary policy credibility and nonlinearities like convexity in the Phillips curve, or really nasty nonlinearities like the effect of lower bound on interest rates. You can read that and you can get all the code and so on if you're interested in playing around with it. So I'd just like to introduce Anna at this point. Um, Anna is one of the students that has been working with us for the last few weeks in Armenia at the Diligent Training and Research Center. As a part of the training for FPAS Mark II, we use the United States as a laboratory. And so we practiced all of our ideas about FPAS Mark II on the United States. So it's kind of interesting that that today that Anna and some of the other students are going to be talking about how they wrote this paper on not the teal book. For people that understand the Fed, the board staff at in Washington produced this teal book, this briefing to the FOMC and so on, but it's not published until 5 years and so on. And so the FOMC now is considering, as Chair Powell described it, dipping their toes and putting more emphasis on this analysis that goes into the briefing package, what's described as the teal book. So our students prepare not the teal book, which is basically an idea about how to implement FPAS Mark II in the current environment. So this is following advice from Larry Summers that became really interested in this and provided important feedback to us early on in the process of developing FPAS Mark II, which is to think about applying it in many countries and asking how the world might have been different if central banks would have had this prudent risk management approach. So Anna, please show us what you've done over the last
Okay.
2 or 3 weeks.
Thank you, Doug, for the introduction. I'll just quickly share my screen. Just 1 second. Okay. Okay, perfect. So, okay. Hello, everyone. Doug already introduced me, but I'm Anna, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. It's truly an honor to share my work in the company of such distinguished guests and colleagues. And as Doug mentioned, I've been part of the Global Forecasting School and the Central Bank of Armenia for just over a month now. And today I'd like to walk you through what we've been working on as part of the Global Forecasting Summer School. Our main project has been something called Not the Teal Book, or NTTB for short. Essentially, this is about applying the FPAS Mark II framework to countries that don't already use FPAS and exploring how central banks can manage uncertainty and communicate policy better. Specifically, we've been working on the Not the Fed Teal Book, and I would like to offer special thanks to Anahit, who is my colleague and friend, because she is the author of this wonderful Not the Teal Book that I'll be presenting. And in the second half of the presentation, I'll also put forward a more conceptual discussion regarding FPAS Mark II within the context of understanding whether advanced economy central banks are prepared to adopt this framework and what this adoption would essentially imply. So the context of the Fed offers a strong motivation for conducting this NTTB exercise because if we look at the summary of economic projections, what stands out is just how much variation there is among these projections. So each member has their own assumptions regarding growth, inflation, and the path of the interest rates. And one of the purposes of FPAS Mark II is to try to produce macro consistent scenarios that the central bank can communicate to maintain credibility. In terms of communicating these variety of scenarios, the Central Bank of Armenia produces a taxonomy of scenarios where the different scenarios within the board might be separated between case A and case B types of considerations. In this step, the objective is not to try to go over the precise descriptions of each scenario, but to try and put a qualitative language to them. Now, internally, the central bank could produce these scenarios, but in terms of creating a public communication, it helps to look at three illustrative scenarios, which include the market reference, referring to what the financial markets think the expected path of the policy rate is going to be. Then a case A scenario where the expected path of the policy rate is above what's priced in the markets, and the case B where it is below. Naturally, the process of building these scenarios starts by looking at what's already priced in the financial markets. So one could look at the expected path of the policy rate in the market reference scenario and ask what story explains this path. In this case, the story is one of stagflation for the very reasons that Anahit has put forward in the slides, which is that tariffs are adding to inflationary pressures, but at the same time, they're expected to weigh on the real economy. So on the one hand, tariffs make imports more expensive, but on the other hand, they also dampen output by reducing efficiency and raising costs. Now let's move to the first alternative scenario, which is case A, and this one is built around changes in immigration policy. The main argument here is that if immigration declines and fewer foreign-born workers are employed, then the sectors that depend on them immediately come under stress. And this is problematic because the natural rate of unemployment is likely to rise because of reduced labor supply and reduced matching efficiency in the job market. And that in turn pushes wages up in those sectors, which then spills over into more persistent inflationary pressures across the economy. Case B comes from a different perspective. It is very much reminiscent of what Chris Waller had argued prior to the FOMC meeting. So it helps to take Waller's very detailed argumentation and try to build a quantitative scenario around it. Here, the assumption is that monetary policy has already been highly restrictive. So we assume that tariffs are still in place, but businesses absorb much of the cost. So inflationary effects aren't as strong. Another assumption is that inflation expectations remain well anchored, which is critical because that prevents second round effects from spiraling out of control. So here the risk lies on the other side, which says that if policy stays too tight for too long, then demand could weaken more than expected. Consumer spending could slow, confidence could fall, and labor market weaknesses could accelerate. In this case, the Fed would need to pivot towards supporting the economy, even if inflation hasn't completely fallen back to target yet. Then we produce the quantitative scenarios. And basically, as I mentioned before, for case A, the key assumption is that potential output growth slows because of lower immigration. That means the economy bumps up against supply constraints, creating excess demand in the short run. Tariff-driven inflation becomes stronger and more persistent, which means that interest rates need to remain higher for longer than markets might expect. For case B, the economy slows sharply, led by weaker consumer demand. But tariff inflation is weaker than feared. Inflation expectations remain stable, and so the Fed can lower rates to support the real economy. So the NTTB exercise shows that FPAS Mark II is about equipping central banks with a framework for thinking about risks under uncertainty. And for the Fed in particular, with challenges ranging from tariffs to immigration to restrictive policy, these tools become even more valuable because they give policymakers the answer to the question of what's the least risky path forward given the uncertainty that we face. From here, we can make a transition to a discussion about the essence of FPAS Mark II, how different are the tools used as part of this framework, and what it means to adopt this framework in practice. And the discussion is framed in the context of the Fed, but these comments will likely be applicable to most advanced economy central banks. So the essence of FPAS Mark II is constituted by the following three elements. We have a least regrets approach, which is a decision-making approach that considers potential alternative outcomes and seeks to minimize the risk of future regret. Then we try to avoid what Olivier Blanchard termed dark corners, which are policy traps that require extraordinary policy action and costs to welfare to escape from. Lastly, credibility is perceived as an important nonlinearity relevant for monetary policy. An example of this would be the euro area entering the pandemic with a lack of credibility, since it had previously allowed inflation expectations to ratchet downwards. So as a result, we have a situation where both the US and the euro area are hit by the same negative shocks. But for the US, where credibility was relatively strong, the reduction in the policy rate and the prolonged period at the lower effective lower bound were sufficient to convince financial markets that inflation would move back towards the 2% target, whereas in the euro area, inflation expectations continued to decline. Now, standard frameworks concentrate on the most likely path for the economy, which might work relatively well in stable environments. But there's also a heavy reliance on linear models and a lack of recognition of fundamental nonlinearities, which is almost like trying to navigate winding mountain roads like the ones that we have here in Dilijan with only a straight line map. This leaves central banks poorly prepared for potential dark corners. Therefore, FPAS Mark II shifts the focus from the baseline forecast to a scenario-driven risk management approach. Here, the central bank is tasked with evaluating multiple plausible futures and minimizing the risks of severe policy mistakes. And this is very important because scenario-based thinking effectively protects credibility because credibility is no longer tied to the accuracy of the forecast. So instead, the central bank acknowledges uncertainty upfront, thereby showing that policymakers are aware of multiple possible outcomes and are prepared to act accordingly. This means that transparency essentially strengthens credibility. Moreover, a risk management mindset changes how policymakers approach trade-offs by recognizing that policy responses are not always linear. So in the endocred framework, which is the analytical backbone of FPAS Mark II, the quadratic loss function allows monetary policy to respond proportionally when deviations of inflation or output are small, but to shift into a nonlinear and more forceful stance when those deviations become large, helping to avoid dark corners and supporting a least regrets strategy. In fact, Alan Greenspan's risk management perspective, expressed in his 2004 speech on monetary policy as risk management, expresses a very similar sentiment to this approach, which is that policy should be set with robustness in mind. This means that we need to weigh potential outcomes not only by their likelihood, but also by the asymmetry of their costs. This is where the policy of least regrets becomes very crucial, because rather than attempting to precisely optimize against an unknowable future, policymakers could aim to choose the choose the course of action that they would least regret if conditions turn out worse than expected. In practice, this means leaning against especially adverse scenarios, even if they appear unlikely. So this means that decisions based on non-probabilistic reasoning can still be effectively communicated through transparency. And this is done by clearly explaining the qualitative rationale behind policy choices rather than relying on numerical probabilities. For example, the CBA's transparency report includes each board member's individual reasoning behind their decision. Whereas in the case of the Fed, the FOMC could supplement quantitative tools like the dot plot with qualitative statements from members, as it happened, say, with Chris Waller. So this use of narrative and qualitative language helps the public to understand the reasoning process, and it also builds credibility even when precise probabilities cannot be assigned. In this context, we can also refer to Ben Bernanke's proposal at the Laubach conference, where he argued that the Fed should publish a staff-prepared baseline forecast for the economy along with alternative scenarios. And this baseline would be a coherent and internally consistent projection of the economy and the federal funds rate, similar in spirit to the market reference scenario used in FPAS Mark II. But the innovation is that in addition to this baseline, the Fed would release selected alternative scenarios, effectively showing how policy would adjust if the economy diverged from the central case. This would arguably give the chair more information to explain the Fed's reaction function, allowing the public to see that the rate path is contingent and shifting as the economy moves from, say, case A to case B. The result would be both educational, because it would help the public to understand how to think about monetary policy under uncertainty, and it would also be credibility enhancing by demonstrating the Fed's commitment to doing the right thing across a range of possible outcomes. Of course, there are very recent empirical examples that show the dangers of sticking to a single narrative in the presence of uncertainty. So the danger is that unprecedented shocks, such as those seen in the aftermath of COVID, require timely recognition and decisive responses, especially when they reveal nonlinear dynamics that can quickly spiral beyond initial expectations. So, as Larry Summers has argued, the Fed's reliance on the transitory narrative left policymakers anchored to a single framework for far too long, even as mounting evidence in the form of underlying measures of inflation or sticky price inflation showed that inflation pressures were broadening and accelerating. And the failure to adjust promptly to shifting realities is dangerous because it undermines public confidence in economic management. But naturally, one might also ask the question of whether having more than one narrative or having these scenario-based insights might lead to indecision instead of informing decisions. And so far, historical evidence has undermined the idea that scenario-based insights could lead to indecision. So when we compare the experience of the Central Bank of Armenia or the National Bank of Georgia, which implemented a scenario-based approach to monetary policy, to that of many other central banks in 2021, we see that this approach helped the former to be decisive and to take preemptive action rather than falling into the trap of sticking to a single narrative. The natural question then is to ask whether non-FPAS central banks have adequate tools and methods to handle nonlinear dynamics, dark corners, or this sort of unprecedented shocks. I would argue that FPAS Mark II does not necessarily require us to invent new tools. Rather, it requires a different way of using existing tools and methods by placing a stronger emphasis on judgment and critical thinking. So, whereas many institutions place excessive reliance on what models can deliver and how their results can be applied, instead of acknowledging that models are merely highly simplified constructs of imagined realities built on layers of assumptions and treating them as just one of several tools to inform economic reasoning and policy, policymakers and economists often end up exaggerating their precision and relevance. And in central banks, especially, complex economic debates might be reduced to phrases like the model says, effectively substituting mechanical output for deeper critical analysis. But supporters of the baseline approach could also contend that its value or its true value does not lie in producing precise predictions, but in the insights gained through the forecasting exercise itself and the subsequent evaluation of its inevitable errors. Put differently, the forecast numbers alone have limited worth, but what matters most is the process of critically assessing the economy, considering possible responses to shocks and risks, and then reflecting on why forecasts missed the mark, whether due to unforeseen events or flaws in judgment. In fact, at the Global Forecasting School, one of the principles is to never say the model says. And to echo Stanley Fisher's famous line, I'd rather have Bob Solo than an econometric model, but I'd rather have Bob Solo with an econometric model than without one. We are implying that judgment always comes first, and an excellent economist with a model is far better than a model on its own. And I guess this is a good note for me to complete this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd be glad to hear your comments or take questions, though with my limited work experience, I may end up learning as much from your questions as from giving my answers. But thank you, and I'll return the floor to Doug.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, to explain to the audience what exactly we're talking about and so on. So the Cleveland Fed has a nowcasting model. So it's like a statistical model and so on that looks at what is the optimal forecast for the CPI, the core CPI, the PCE, and the core PCE. And of course, they reviewed the performance of that model through this COVID period. The first phase that you were talking about where things were expansionary, and then of course when we got hit with the stagflationary shocks as we tried to open up the economy and ran into bottlenecks and stuff. And what they argue in that paper is that if you compare their model to other models, that it actually performs really well. It's still the best model and stuff. But when one understands what the best model is, I think one can understand what the issues are. So in the nowcasting model of the Cleveland Fed, the really only advantage that it has is that they get gasoline prices and other refined petroleum products a little bit earlier. This is data collected by the Energy Information Agency, and when we look at the optimal forecast, it's basically just based on the observed year-on-year inflation rate at that point. So there's an assumption that basically inflation is going to revert back to the observed year-on-year inflation rate. So obviously, if the world is stable and always reverting back to 2%, then that forecasting rule is going to work well. But it's not going to work very well if the economy is entering an inflationary environment like it was in 2021 and so on. And so we think about this quite a bit differently. We put a lot of emphasis on developing measures of inflation that are non-standard. So I'm referring to things like non-traded sticky price inflation. What we mean by that specifically is keeping track of the prices of goods and services that are typically set infrequently. And if one looks at that and thinks about it that way and asks, well, if you are in an inflationary environment, or if you're going into an inflationary environment and you're a price setter or a wage setter, because they're also typically set infrequently. If you are in this inflationary environment, or you think that you're heading into an inflationary environment, you're going to be raising your price partly because maybe you've fallen behind the price increases that have already been experienced on competing products that are also set infrequently. But in addition to that, you're going to be looking ahead because your price is going to be fixed for some period of time. Think of a rental property and so on. So reflected in the actual behavior of prices that are typically set infrequently will be forecasts of where inflation is going in the future. And if you look at that in 2021 and have had people been looking at that in 2021, you would have concluded that inflation was likely to be rising, and that forecasting rules such as looking at the observed year-on-year inflation rate is going to be looking out the rearview mirror instead of looking out the front windshield and so on. So, but that's one aspect. The other aspect, of course, is not just thinking about case A scenarios, but asking, what if you were wrong and you pushed a case B scenario where inflation was assumed to be transitory and it turned out to be more persistent? At what point are you going to lose your credibility and allow inflation expectations to ratchet upwards? So I just wanted to clarify, specifically what you mean, like what do we mean when we say be careful about over reliance on statistical models and spend more time thinking about how the economy works and what's reflected in the behavior of price setters. The same argument applies to things like consumer confidence and so on. We have surveys of consumer confidence, but they're not very informative for actually thinking about consumption behavior. So it's more important to have analytical framework that that allows the economist to think through those issues as opposed to relying on these models that that obviously are not going to work very well in environments that are inflationary or when things are changing quite rapidly and so on. But we have some questions. I mean, uh, did you put together some questions? There were some questions
Oh,
that were raised by the Bank of Canada. So these are questions that are going to be asked on the panel. And I'm sure that Charles will be very interested in these questions. Can you please maybe take
yep.
us through what those questions are? And then I think
Yeah, of course.
maybe we can get Charles' reaction to these questions. So
Okay.
these are questions that were sent out to the panelists to try to prepare for this uh, panel that is going to take place on September 5th at the Bank of Canada. So please.
Right. So the first set of questions is about framing a risk management approach. And basically, I was answering some of the questions in my presentation, but it was more implicit. But if we go over them, you'll see how I was addressing them. So the first one is about the essence of a risk management approach. If you see an interesting question that you would like to discuss, as I'm, yeah, just tell me to stop. And then how does it differ from standard forecast-based frameworks? I already talked about that as well. This one I probably didn't mention. Is it an approach to be used only in exceptional times, or should it always be a central organizing principle? And our answer would be that it is a organizing principle, because using this framework in the normal times, helps prepare for the exceptional times. Mm,
So can we just talk about that for a second? Okay. So in times like 2021, okay, um, you would a policymaker would probably be emphasizing case A, and of course, if one thought about least regrets, what would the cost of believing in case B, this transitory approach? And the answer would be that you might end up in case X, where inflation expectations really ratchet up on you. And then the question is, what are the costs? And in the case of in the U.S., it required about a 500 basis point increase in interest rates to try to contain those inflationary pressures. But one of the questions that's going to be addressed in the panel is that, and maybe we can get Charles' feedback on this, is do you just pull out least regrets during times when you think that you're exposed to either asymmetric risks or when the costs of messing up could be large in potentially a situation where you might allow inflation expectations to drift up, or the same thing is true of also allowing inflation expectations to ratchet down, like was the case, for example, during the global financial crisis and afterwards. When central banks like the ECB had problems finding the policies that got inflation up to 2% in a sustainable way. And then, of course, when COVID happened in the first phase, which was contractionary, they were already at the effective lower bound, whereas the Fed had, given that they had been successful in getting inflation up, they had policy space. They had already renormalized interest rates and then had space when COVID hit and the initial phase was contractionary, so they had some policy space to deal with it. Now we would argue, or many would argue, that probably they went too far with expansionary policies and so on. But at least it shows the idea that if you fail to keep the economy away from these dark corners, that your policy space is going to be constrained uh, when you need it potentially, such as was the case in the very initial phases of COVID. But Charles, what are your views? Um, some central banks, like the Reserve Bank in New Zealand, they seem to be doing it, like you mentioned, least regrets from time to time. Otherwise, it's business as usual. But do you have any views about this, Charles?
Well,
Should you?
first of
Yeah.
all, I'd like to congratulate Anna on a very clear and very well done presentation. I thought it was very nicely done, so
Thank you.
very good. One of the things that immediately comes to mind, a number of things do, is exactly what you mean by least regrets. Let me try and explain. In your Not the Teal book, you've got two alternatives. Alternative one is that um, the tariff increase in prices is relatively transitory and everything comes back to normal fairly soon. And the risks are a bit that the labor market might weaken. And so there's a case for lowering interest rates. The alternative, partly due to a shortage of labor because of the decline in inward migration, is that inflation continues and worsens. Now, in a sense, you don't have to do anything very much to get inflation back to where you want in your sort of more optimistic uh, alternative. Whereas actually, if there's a shortage of labor and if the tariffs have a longer term effect and you lose credibility, then you are going to lose a great deal in terms of your objective of controlling inflation. But if you are in the central bank now and you've got a politician like President Trump there and you do nothing, you infuriate the president, and the possibility is that the central bank independence might get severely compromised. So there are two problems. One is a political problem, the other is an economic problem. What do you mean by least regret under these circumstances? It's not necessarily at all clear. I mean, if it was purely in terms of short-term inflation management, the least regret is to do nothing. If you, however, consider a longer term political institutional situation, the least regret might be to actually lower interest rates. There's no politics in your least regret. There's no sort of institutional arrangements. Um, and so that would worry me. I don't necessarily know what I would mean by least regret. Then take two other things, um, which is general about concern about the FPAS. You have your case A and you have your case B. Are they equal probability or are they not equal probability? Do you have any idea what the probabilities of these cases are? If they're not equal probability, then you need to take account of that. And again, you just don't mention what are the probabilities of the cases that you're discussing. And a further one, which always worries me, is that it takes a very long time before we actually know where we are. For example, in the case of the increasing inflation that we had in 22, 23, um, for a long time, people thought, again, it was all going to be very transitory. So it takes time before you can actually be sure which of the cases you're in. It's not always easy to see it initially. And one of the problems that I find with FPAS is that, and here I could be wrong, is that you've got to have some idea about how long it will be before the central bank knows whether it's on case A or case B. It can't immediately respond because it doesn't know which case is which. And so you ought to take account of the time lag in the response to deciding where actually you're going. Anyhow, that's enough for me for the time for the time being. You know, what is least regret when you've got to take into account politics and institutions as well as inflation? Um, what are the probabilities of your risks? Do you have any idea? Do you know which is bigger? And how soon can you actually be fairly sure which risk line or in which risk direction you are moving?
So, Anna, do you want to take the first stab at that? These are
Sure, I'll
difficult.
share.
These are two really super difficult questions,
I
but
never try. I don't want to ask
we
easy
would never
questions.
expect anything less from Charles. Okay, so please.
I must say thank you for the questions. They're very, very thought-provoking. With regards to your first question, the least regrets, I personally, when I was like constructing my case A and case B, I was thinking about it only from the perspective of economics, not not the socio-political context. I think if we're moving into the field of politics as well, then it's important to talk about what agents we're specifically discussing and who are the actors in the situation in order to think about the incentives of the actors. So the least regrets, it varies depending on whether we're talking about individuals or institutions. So far, we've only been assessing it from the perspective of the central bank and the economic perspective, which is, in my understanding, the least regrets is that we recognize that different possibilities have an asymmetry of within their costs, and we want to avoid we're trying to be risk averse essentially, and trying to avoid the possibility that would be most damaging. But yeah, regarding from the political perspective, I do not have an answer for that. I think it just depends on what the incentives of the relevant actors are. And the least regrets depends on that, on their incentives.
I would add to that. The second question, Charles, I think that we focused on all those issues. The idea is that most of the time, and this is also the case of the models and stuff. Sometimes we're just asking too much to think that we can quantify probabilities and so on. So but we take very serious attention to things like lags in the transmission mechanism and so on. That's why we have things like forward-looking loss functions that try to find the paths for the policy rate that would be consistent with avoiding dark corners and so on. But so this is the way that it works. To be clear, the staff, and this is what Ben Bernanke is also recommending in his Lowback speech, produce something that looks very much like what we refer to as our market reference scenario. And then through discussions, they talk about all the possible risks in this taxonomy and so on. But then through those discussions, the staff choose case A and case B types of scenarios that they think the board members will be able to relate to. And then it's the responsibility of the board to then describe what are the types of scenarios that they find the most worrisome, the ones that they're trying to avoid. So economists can, I think, reliably tell the policymakers what the probabilities are. And in fact, I think that if they tried to, that would probably result in even bigger errors. Alan Greenspan has a wonderful quote when he was introducing us to these ideas. And he said that, we should try to quantify when it makes sense. And I would say that, when we look at the amount of work out there that tries to quantify probabilities when you have nonlinear models, there's almost no guidance in the practice of doing monetary policy where people can do that. So that's left, up to judgment of the people that are making the decisions. Perhaps economists can do research in those areas, and maybe someday we'll be able to provide guidance on what the probabilities might be. But at this point, given the state of our knowledge, I think it would be foolhardy to think that that people can just develop quantitative frameworks and to tell policymakers what the probabilities are. So instead, what we try to do is to ask them what it is that they think is more likely, and to reflect that in their policy action and their communications about the rationale for why they're worried about one particular scenario or another scenario, and how that's related to the actual decision that they take, and how they rationalize that decision to the public, and so on. With regard to the issue about central bank independence, I think at the end of the day, that's a question of leadership. At the end of the day, they have to try and do the right thing. And I think most of the time, when they say that they don't bring political factors into those decisions, I think I would favor that than responding to political commentary and then taking action. But I can imagine a practical person that would think about a possible trade-off if they didn't cut rates, if that would further threaten central bank independence, then that would be a very difficult situation, and I think that's why strong leadership is required. But I to respond to your question, we've got all those, the second part of your question, we've thought about those things, I think, pretty clearly, and we have a framework that works. But stick around. In 4 minutes, Governor Gelstian will be here, and maybe he can take a stab at explaining what his reflections on not only developing FPAS Mark II, but how implementation has gone over the last year and a half.
I thought that was very clear. It actually relates to quite a lot of the questions of question area 2 under the questions to help frame your policy about scenario design and decision making. I thought it was very clear what you said, and I understand that, and I think it very reasonable. But I think that I think what you said was clear and well presented, and actually that's more or less what you'll have to say, I think, again when it comes to the discussion of question area 2 in the question set that you were given.
Okay. Asya, Jared, I just want to make sure that the governor got the link, um, because I just got a text saying that he didn't get the link. Asya, are you there, or Jared? Um, just to make sure that somebody has sent him the correct link so that he can get in. I'm sure he'll be here in a minute.
Can I, while we're waiting, perhaps I might just say one other thing, which again
Yes, please.
slightly relates to politics. You will remember that Mark Carney was very keen on environmental risks. And I think that environmental risk is really about real things, not so much monetary things. And I would be inclined to say that environmental risk is something that a central bank should probably not take into consideration. But on the other hand, it's probably something that Mark Carney will be pressing the Bank of Canada to do. And at any rate, you should have some kind of idea about how you would respond to a question from the Bank of Canada about should we take environmental risk into consideration.
My my response to that would be only insofar that it was relevant for monetary policy and so on. So, one could imagine a situation where some we had some really bad environmental event that had implications for the economy, and so there might be some situations where it's relevant for monetary policy. Uh, Financial stability, which
But
is
what
not
would
monetary
let me give you a
policy,
case.
might be a different kind
Let
of
me give you let me
argument
give
and
you
so
a
on.
case in point. Here in the UK, we've had a bad drought. The effect of that has been to raise food prices quite a lot. This has helped to drive inflation above target. Now, you may say it's transitory and it'll come back when climate changes and improves a bit, because the drought has been very considerable. On the other hand, food is exactly what most people worry about because it's price they see all the time. And if the Bank of England does nothing, might reduce its credibility. So what do you do?
Well, it certainly raises some communication issues. Um, because I mean, this is what the Fed and other central banks have experienced when they brought inflation back, towards their 2% targets. Most people didn't look at quantitative magnitudes of inflation, but looked at things like the price of eggs and said inflation looks really high. So they can't really distinguish between things like levels and rates of change, and that's a very practical communication problem that central banks have to deal with, and so on. So you know, I you have to figure out some way of communicating to people about what they actually care about, and so on. Um, so yeah, but typically, I would think about food prices and energy prices and things like that as being proximate causes of inflation. And we wouldn't want central banks to get too lost in the proximate causes, and to realize that they are ultimately responsible for where underlying inflation goes over time and so on. But to go back to your issue about environmental issues, there could very well be situations where it clearly could pose risks for financial stability and so on. But that, I think, is different than factoring in things like environmental uh, situations where the central bank has to incorporate it into its thinking about monetary policy and so on. But so that would be my take about I think one of the issues that central banks face is that their mandates um, have gotten too broad and so on, and they have to make sure that they don't lose track of the things that they can actually do well, which is to focus on providing an anchor for inflation and inflation expectations and so on. If they bring too many other things into the picture, it risks, I think, losing focus on those key objectives of monetary policy. Voskin, there we go. Martin. Oh, thank you.
Oh,
We were fearful that you didn't get the link. Charles, Anna has given a wonderful presentation, and Charles has asked her some really tough questions and so on. What I would like to ask you is to share your reflections, not only on developing the prudent risk management approach at the Central Bank of Armenia, but also implementing it. So you've now had about a year and a half um, to using FPAS Mark II. So maybe you could share your reflections on both the development and implementation of it, please.
so first of all, let me thank you for this opportunity to talk to you all. And then, Charles, very good to see you again. I think if we look back, we need to start at the point where we started with FPAS Mark I. where you know better than everyone else how much work has been done to develop that structural framework that we start using. Was very difficult period of time when we did a lot of stuff for modeling and then how team communicates with the board and all the dynamics. But at one point, we probably realized that there is a lot of uncertainty and there is, I would call it a bit of folly in baseline, but there were some problems that we've discussed that in length. Who owns the process? Is it a team or is it a board? What is the responsibility of individual board members? How do we decide? How do we structure it? And then I can see the slide that we always use about 3 ingredients and then FPAS Mark II and FPAS Mark I. So I think with rising uncertainty around the globe, we decided that it's the right time to move to something more credible from our perspective, which was trying to tell the stories about scenarios, not trying to squeeze all complexity of the world in one line, but letting us tell the story about where we see the economy going, what are the driving forces, and try to communicate in a more proper way. So we started probably right on time because uncertainty got even bigger with things like COVID and then afterwards our own war with Azerbaijan. And then on the top of that, we had Russia, Ukraine, which created a lot of uncertainty for us. And then just to give you an example how difficult it was at the time to bring everything into one baseline, imagine that Russia-Ukraine started in February 2022, on February 24 to be exact. And then on February 26, the board of the Central Bank of Armenia had a meeting to decide on interest rate. And then obviously when your first reaction to Russia-Ukraine would be that it will be definitely a negative external demand shock for Armenian economy. And then what do you naturally do when there is an external negative shock hitting your economy at that speed and height? You definitely need to decrease the interest rates. But at the same time, there were also a possibility, a scenario that we discussed, that what if Russians start moving to Armenia? And that would be the exact opposite what I just described. It will be a positive external shock for Armenian economy if Russians move. And then what do you do with that? If like it was the baseline that we move with the first scenario, and then we think about alternatives around it, we will definitely need to kind of cut the interest rates. But at the same time, we try to somehow counterbalance with both, taking into account. And then we decided to keep the interest rates at the same level and to wait and see, to see more data coming and then to be more sure what's happening. And that exact same year, we had 12.6% economic growth. And we saw things that we never saw before. Hundreds of thousands of Russians in the streets of Yerevan, IT engineers, business people, and so on and so forth. So people who had money, people who had knowledge, and then who came with money, which created a very big positive external shock for the Armenian economy, which, to put it in the context, we're just recovering from our first cycle. So we're bringing the inflation down after the COVID spending cycle. And then another shock hit us. So we increased the rates again. And then we increased the rates, I think, 10 or 12 times consecutively because that external shock was a prolonged one. And then during each meeting, we were trying to see where the economy is going, what are the driving forces for that, what should be done, and so on and so forth. That would be probably the frame that we start using. But how do we communicate that to general public so they understand what we think? And that's where this radical transparency approach came. And then what we did and what stand out to be a unique set of things that we grouped in one approach was that we introduced something to be accountable at the level of each individual board member. So besides having attributed votes, which is probably common for many other central banks, and then attributed minutes, which comes the same day as the decision is made, which is not common to my understanding. And several central banks do attributed minutes, but they publish it later, like in 2 weeks or some time later. We added on one more layer, which was attributed or not attributed, but one pager from each and single board member, trying to explain her or his position, why he or she made that decision, trying to explain what they think about case A, what they think about case B, how do they structure it in their mind, and what was behind their decision. And I think we were I'll tell you that we were hesitant because we heard a lot of skepticism about media being able to absorb it and transfer it to general public. What type of questions would come? Would media and then IMF and the World Bank will be disappointed with losing the baseline from the central bank not telling them what would be the economic growth and the inflation projection for the year? But I think all in all, with all those things, we took courage and then we decided to go with that. And then I think my impression is, because I'm giving press conferences after every single meeting, it's 8 times a year. I feel that our economic journalists also get educated with us at the same time. And the questions that I'm getting from them is becoming richer and richer, which probably one of our aims to reach out to general public through media. And then another layer would be our meeting with the professionals, with market participants, which also helps us to convey the message through markets and educate them. So it's kind of a loop, because if we educate them better, they give us better projection, which we use to place our case A and case B. That also helps. So in that sense, I think all in all, it was a very positive experience. And then if one asks me whether I would advise them to go with that, I would say definitely yes. I know there will be complicated issues with bigger countries with more deep financial markets, and then financial markets ability to absorb the info which comes not in one line, but you tell them the stories and multiple scenario analysis. But I think it's absolutely worth it, Doug.
Well, I'd just like to flesh out one of the points that you touched on, and that's the importance of the institutional framework and so on. So when these regimes were initially created, some of them chose legally to give individual accountability to the board members and so on. But naturally, when you would develop the regime inside a central bank, it would be very much a learning by doing kind of exercise. And one of the problems with FPAS Mark I is that there was perhaps over-reliance on the staff, where the staff would play this leadership role, and the board would effectively kind of rubber stamp the staff, because the staff had perhaps more expertise about the subject matter. But then obviously over time, you would want the people that are truly in charge of monetary policy to have as much say about it as possible, and so on. So the reason I liked your story, Martin, is that you're trying to create an active debate among the staff and the board, and so on. And when you think about how that actually works, there's always one person that leads the process. In other words, to go back to your point about when you interpreted the initial shock, you thought it was probably going to be contractionary. But then there's this lone kind of wolf that there's got to be always somebody, right? That basically says no, 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 it's the other way. And then, of course, as the evidence, and this relates very much to what Charles said earlier, as the evidence then accumulates, the lone wolf then is joined by the other people because the evidence is pushing that in that direction. So I think at the end of the day, Martin, but maybe you might comment on this. I think the board members feel like they have much greater opportunity to think about monetary policy and contribute to it. But would you agree with
I'll
those?
definitely agree with that because, and I'll give you my personal story. So I've been a board member before becoming the chairman. And then I was a board member when we were still with FPAS Mark I. And then it was a completely different experience. As you said, staff was in charge and you were coming to the meeting prepared, but at the same time, the full reins were at the hands of the staff. And then they will give you the model and then they will try to explain to you what's going on. And then they even would tell you what they think the interest rate should be. And then you could either agree or disagree. There could be a debate, but debate was not as rich as we're having it now. But let me give you also another insight that just came to my mind. Nowadays, everyone talks about central bank independence and all the things. I think being able to have board members who are part of the process, who are very well educated and they understand the monetary policy making, helps you and protects you from any kind of attack. So political appointees would have a very difficult time to appear on that board, where everyone else is kind of a professional in a setting, and then you come as a political appointee, and that would be a problem for you, because you would be a lonely wolf, but not in a sense that you put it, but in a way that you don't understand what these guys are talking about. And that would be very discomfortable for you to go out to the press and with your one-pager and try to explain what your stand is. So that also helps us to protect our own independence in a way.
So I'd like to ask one more question, but Charles might have a question for you as well. And this has to do with the leadership. Like when I think of a governor, I think he's got two roles to play. And you might say that everybody in the board has these two roles to play. One is doing good monetary policy today, and the other is investing in the institution so that it will become stronger over time. And I think that's that at the end of the day is going to be your only defense when central bank independence is attacked is whether or not you develop the framework to do that. But FPAS Mark II at the Central Bank of Armenia, it took about 15 months to go from the October 2022 paper to the launch and so on. Could you tell a little bit about, if you were providing advice to another central bank? Armin, for example, said in a recent workshop, is that if you can't get the job done in 18 months to 2 years, you're probably not going to get it done. But can you tell a little bit about the issues involved in doing monetary policy and developing frameworks at the same time? Are there any secrets that the Central Bank of Armenia has learned, especially when it's a board? Okay, it's completely different when you have a governor decision maker model. So, for example, I think this would be accurate when we talked about, for example, the Bank of Canada. I think legally it's still the case that the governor is responsible, and he has a monetary policy committee that acts as an advisory board. And there's a certain advantage to that in terms of developing frameworks, because the governor can just say, I want you guys to. He can delegate and so on. And whereas when you have a board, there are challenges of both doing monetary policy and at the very same time developing a framework. So did you learn anything through the process of developing the framework that you started to apply earlier? Or did you think of it more as I had to develop the framework and then things changed drastically once you started to implement it?
So I think what we did parallel processing in two domains. One was staff, and the second one was the board. So I wouldn't stop much on talking about staff, but I'll try to give you my understanding of what happened with the board. So it was a governor-centric with FPAS Mark I, more or less. So governor was the one who was talking to the staff, and then the rest of the board were like able to ask questions, but everyone was looking at the governor, what the governor wants to hear. With FPAS Mark II, it's like we started with a very genuine approach when I said that I want you to be part of the process as much as I am part of the process. That's why I think you need to start with a genuine approach and then tell people that you want them to be part of the process itself. And then I think one of the breaking points was that when they saw that there was a meeting when I was in minority, and then the vote went against what I was thinking it should be, but I went to the press conference and I defended what the board decided. And then I think they really took it from there, and they understood that what I'm saying, I really mean it. So if I say that I want you to be part of the process, and this is a common thing that we're doing, and then I'll defend whatever majority decides, and then I really did it with the press conference, I think the realization came that this guy is not joking, and it's very serious, so let's do something. And then they get very much involved in the process, more than anyone else in the room, that they come to Portugal, they spend time with you, and then I think they're genuinely interested in the process. And later on, when we were able to achieve several milestones, I think there was also a moment of pride that we were able to do that. So as you mentioned, in 1.5 years or something, we're able to deliver something, and which, to be honest, it's not the case in the central bank with all the projects that we implement. There are projects that we completely fail. There are projects that we succeed, but this one was the one that we succeeded from my perspective. And then board is very proud of what we did. And then that also gives me a comfort that institutionally, if I leave the institution, let's say tomorrow, and then there is a new governor, I think that the chances of new governor playing the game that we have built around the framework and the culture that we have built is much more than previously we had.
Could I,
So,
could I make, could I
yes,
make a
please,
comment
Charles.
now?
Yeah.
The point that I would like to make is that Martin, the governor, has very much connected the process of institutional change in the decision-making procedure at the board with the switch from FPAS Mark I to FPAS Mark II. I don't think that connection is necessary. Let me explain.
Mhm.
Individual accountability was instituted at the Bank of England the moment it became independent in 1997. One of the problems of a board is that the board members normally have other responsibilities for operations, for financial stability, and so on, which take up a lot of their time and mean that they don't have time on the whole to get involved in the forecasting process. And that's one of the reasons why the staff centrality occurs. Now, that was overcome in the Bank of England by the adoption of external members of the Monetary Policy Committee, of which I was one of the first. Now, external members had no other responsibility and became closely involved with the forecasting process and were able and had no particular concern about dissenting from that agreement or from that forecast. So staff centrality was never a problem in the Bank of England, and there was always the ability and for anyone dissenting, which was usually the externals, they not only had the ability, they were required to make the reasons for their dissent publicly known, both before the House of Commons Select Committee and in public. So the question of not having too much staff centrality and board control can be overcome by other means, and it is not necessarily central to the move between FPAS Mark I, which the Bank of England maintained, and FPAS Mark II. The difference is about whether you put all your money on the single best estimate or the single forecast, or whether you have scenarios. So that the question of the process of decision making at the board and whether you have independent members and all of that and staff centrality is not actually part of the FPAS exercise. It came with FPAS in your case in Armenia, but it's not a necessary. And you can get exactly your independence, you can get the overcoming staff centrality without FPAS Mark II. The two are actually logically separate.
Yeah. No, I agree with that, Charles. So there are many different ways that you can share the cap. That's obviously true. In our case, I would say that because we're a unitary board, but some of the board members are executive board members, and the rest, like 3 are executive and 5 are non-executive, they are much more involved in policy making. So they do have time to kind of concentrate on things like financial stability and monetary policy making. But obviously, you are right. It came central to FPAS Mark II would be baseline versus scenarios. But also, we try to build this institutional muscle when we try to get more involvement from non-executive board members around the topic, which is probably the central for the Central Bank of Armenia. And then there are not too many academic or economists in general in Armenia, which is a very small country, who could be external board members and challenge the central bank stuff in a way that it could be done in England.
Agreed. Entirely agreed.
Yeah, I think it's history, okay? Because in a lot of these central banks, when they first were thrown into the inflation targeting world, they didn't have a lot of expertise. And if the expertise was concentrated initially in the staff, then I think Mark I was quite attractive because it increased the efficiency of the process. But I think you're right, Charles, that those things don't have to be connected. They just happen to be. Because for many of the central banks, the emerging markets, they were thrown into well, I guess that's true of the United Kingdom too, with the ERM and so on. But point accepted that
No.
that it's partly a problem with FPAS Mark I, and and kind of over reliance on the staff. So you can just think of maybe FPAS Mark II is the process maturing and so on. And I would say actually, if you look at what's happening in the Czech Republic, other FPAS Mark One central banks, um, the failure to extend the framework so that the board feels like that they're in charge of the process, that can be a real issue that these FPAS Mark One central banks can face. But anyway, good points. Any other concluding remarks that you would like to give,
Right.
Governor or
Could
Charles?
I ask a quick comment?
Yes, please. Javier.
Hello. Yes, hello, Doug, and everybody. I'd like to make a short comment on the experience of Colombia. It is very interesting, the process of going to Mark Pass 2 by having the members of the board getting them involved in the forecast. And also, it is very interesting to learn that the external members of the MPC also they are dedicated to this forecasting process. In Colombia, since the creation of inflation targeting, we have a different thing. Of course, where the board is established by the constitution, by the national constitution. So it is something that is legally very, difficult to change, to experiment. This is something. This is made by the Constitution. It is ordered by the Constitution. But we have an informal group of three researchers reporting to the board a second view, an alternative view every quarter. And I personally run a forecast, and then we may dissent. We are all three researchers, and we comment on the minutes, we comment on the forecast. Our forecast may be different. We also propose a decision on interest rates. So this, of course, this is at another level. There is, of course, a lot of staff centrality, but it is not that is the only single view that is out there. So given that the board of the banks are matters that involve the constitution, the law, etc., this is probably an informal way. We're not even a committee. There are not statutes about this group in the bank. But it is an informal group that does present an alternative view, and that to me, I think that it has proven good in in things like commenting the minutes, talking about the scenarios, what the policy decision could be. So I thought it would be good to share that experience. That group has been there since the creation of inflation targeting in the 2001 or two. Some say that the inflation targeting was made in Colombia in 1999, but this group started to work since I think 2021 or 22.
Okay. Very good, very good. I have to run because the tunnel is going to close, and unless I get going here, I'm not going to be able to get to Yerevan and so on. So, but thanks, Avier, for those comments. And thanks, Charles, as always, for taking your time to give us feedback and ask us tough questions. And thanks, Governor, for your reflections and your insights. Okay, so
Thank you very much.
and,
It was
and
lovely.
Anna, wonderful presentation. I agree
Yes, indeed.
entirely with Charles. It was amazing. So thank you. And
Thank
thanks
you.
all the other students. The other students, I should say that too, that you were all great. Okay, that we just happened to choose Anna to be the person that was actually doing the presentation today, but I'm sure it would have gone just as well if somebody else would have joined us. Okay, so thanks, and we'll see you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. See you.